Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to be talking about rank, aristocracy and titles within 19th century literature. So, you're reading a novel from the 19th century, maybe it's by Jane Austen or Charles Dickens or Anthony Trollope, and you've encountered a character with a title. They're called Lord or Lady or Sir, someone or other, and you're vaguely aware that that means they are someone important and possibly wealthy, but you're left with quite a few questions, such as, why does Sir William Lucas in Pride and Prejudice seem less important socially than Sir Thomas Bertram in Mansfield Park? Why is Lady Dedlock in Bleak House addressed by her surname, whereas Lady Susan in Lady Susan is addressed by her first name? And then just when you've got to grips with the kind of title people you get in Dickens and Jane Austen, you pick up an Anthony Trollope novel and you meet some Marquises and some Viscounts, and you can see that a Duke is more important than an Earl, but who are Barons again? And where do Viscounts fit in? And you're thinking to yourself, why on earth is the eldest son of the Marquis of Old Recce called Lord Nitterdale? Fear not, I'm here to answer all of your questions. So before I get stuck into the nitty-gritty of the 19th century British aristocracy and how it features in literature, I imagine that this might be the kind of video that people find on searches. So if you don't know me, hi, I'm Katie. I'm an author and an editor. I write historical fiction and I also edit novels. And I also love 19th century literature and learning about 19th century history. I've been meaning to make this video for ages because I think it might be useful for readers of 19th century literature, especially if you read, authors like Anthony Trollope, who like to have a lot of titled characters within their books. These kinds of videos do take quite a lot of prep, so I'm really grateful to everyone who supports me over on Patreon, who gives me more time to make these kind of videos. So before anything else, let me say that the system of kind of title and rank and aristocracy within 19th century Britain, it's quite fiddly and it's quite hard to get your head around. Partly that's because it's really old and has a long history, but also in a way it's almost like designed to be difficult. Within, 19th century society, amongst the upper classes, knowing this stuff was part of etiquette. This kind of stuff was central to 19th century upper class society. At a 19th century dinner party, the person with the highest rank would go in to dinner first. Unless there was a new bride, then sometimes she would take precedent. But anyway, the person with the highest rank would usually go in first. They would often sit nearest to the top of the table, next to the host. And if you didn't know who was more important than someone else, if you didn't know where they came in rank and precedent, then you would be showing that you weren't as, sophisticated or socially knowledgeable as the other people around them. This kind of stuff was almost meant to be complicated so that you could prove you were part of the in-group by knowing it. Some of this stuff is quite ridiculous, but it's also quite interesting. I definitely find all this stuff fascinating. So I've said in the title of this video, and I will talk throughout this video about 19th century aristocracy and titles, but obviously most of this was the same before the 19th century and continued on after the 19th century. But the 19th century is my area of expertise. I don't necessarily know when things changed before or after, so we're going to stick with talking about the 19th century. In general, you don't need to know all of this stuff to appreciate wonderful 19th century literature and to understand some of the social intricacies of social interactions within 19th century literature, but I do think it can be quite helpful. Personally, I kind of taught myself all of this stuff because I find it interesting, and also because I'm a writer of historical fiction. My second novel, The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, which came out in July 2024, has a lot in it about social etiquette and rank, and I wanted to make sure in the writing of this book that I was completely correct, and so I went on a kind of a mission to understand this stuff more than I had before. I do also find that as an editor, I line edit and copy edit quite a lot of historical fiction set in the 19th century, and this stuff comes up a lot, and as I said, it's quite fiddly, so I do often find myself kind of helping out with this kind of stuff for other people's work as well. Very niche skill and knowledge to have, but I do find it quite useful in my editorial work too. A lot of this knowledge of mine comes from, general research online and elsewhere, but one really great resource for learning about etiquette and rank in the 19th century is this wonderful book by Mallory James, Elegant Etiquette in the 19th Century. It's fantastic. Lots of my information here comes from this book. Okay, so first off, let's separate the aristocracy from the titled commoners, because these are two different things. So if someone is called Lord something, if you encounter a character in a novel and they're Lord something, Lord somewhere, then that means they're a peer. They're an aristocrat, they're a lord. All of these things kind of mean the same thing. Basically, historically within the British political system, all of these people, all of these aristocrats, these lords, would sit in the House of Lords. The UK had, and indeed has, two political chambers: the elected House of Commons for commoners, i.e. non-aristocratic people, and the House of Lords, which was historically for lords or peers, aristocrats, whatever you want to call them. We do still have a House of Lords in the UK. Nowadays it has lots of experts and other people who get made peers for life, so they're also called Lord, but the life peers didn't inherit their title and won't pass it on. There are still some hereditary peers in the House of Lords in the UK, which is quite ridiculous, but, you know, that's not a discussion for today. So if someone in a 19th century novel is called Lord something, that probably means they are a peer. I'll talk more about the different kinds of peers or lords in a second, and they sit in the House of Lords. There is a chance, if someone's called Lord something, that they could be the son of someone who sits in the House of Lords. So they're actually the son of an aristocrat, but we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. So those are the lords, they are the aristocrats, the peers, but you also get titled commoners. So if you encounter a character called Sir something, they are either a baronet or a knight. They're a titled commoner, not an aristocrat. The baronets and knights are not technically part of the aristocracy. They're not sitting in the House of Lords within the 19th century. If they wanted to be in Parliament, they'd need to be elected to the House of Commons. They are not part of the aristocracy, but they are titled commoners, and they are kind of beneath the aristocracy in the social order. So within 19th century British society, there were 5 ranks of the aristocracy. So 5 ranks below the royal family. So at the top is the rank of duke. Dukes are the most senior aristocrats. Beneath a duke would be a marquis. This is said marquis is spelt slightly not like you would imagine it would be spelled from how it's said, and also there are 2 different spellings for marquis. So how it's usually spelled today is not how it was often spelled in the 19th century. I'll leave both spellings on the screen so you can see what I mean. So that's number 1 duke, number 2 marquis, number 3 the third rank of the aristocracy is Earl. Beneath Earls are Viscounts, and beneath that are Barons. So Barons are the lowest rank of the aristocracy. And a baron is a different thing from a baronet. A baron you would call lord, a baronet you would call sir. I'm going to talk more about all of those different ranks in a second, but a few things to note about those ranks. All of these in the 19th century were hereditary titles passing down through the male line. Lord is not a rank of its own. All of those 5 different people I've just spoken about, all those 5 titles, they are all varieties of lord. Someone is not merely a lord. Someone is a viscount or a baron or a duke, and you call them lord something. A lord is like an umbrella term for all the aristocrats. Another thing worth being aware of is that there aren't equal amounts of all of these different kinds of aristocrats. I was really struggling to find like exact numbers, so I'm not certain how accurate these are, but one source I found said that in 1818, so, you know, early on in the 19th century, there were across England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, 28 dukes, 32 marquises, 210 earls, 66 viscounts and 172 barons. So there were more earls than anyone else, and there were hardly any dukes. I expect that by the end of the 19th century, there were probably more across the board of all aristocrats. Well, probably not more dukes. I'm not sure if there were any dukedoms created in the 19th century. There might have been, but there were definitely quite a lot of people who were made barons across the 19th century. Because baron was the lowest rank of the aristocracy, if the monarch wanted to reward someone for something, they might knight them. We'll talk about that more in a second, but they also might make them a lord, and usually your first rung on the aristocracy being baron, they would make them a baron. So for example, if you've heard of the famous 19th century poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, he was poet laureate for a lot of the Victorian period, and he was born as Alfred Tennyson, no title or anything like that, but in 1884 Queen Victoria made him a baron, the first Baron Tennyson, when he was 75 years old, kind of in recognition of his services to literature. So that's why he's often called Alfred, Lord Tennyson, because he was known as Alfred Tennyson for most of his life, and then he became a lord, and it wouldn't be right to just call him Alfred Tennyson or Mr. Tennyson anymore. It would be only correct to call him Lord Tennyson, so he's usually called Alfred, Lord Tennyson. So some other interesting things about the ranks of the British aristocracy. Is it weird that there are viscounts but no counts? Yes. There are also countesses, as we're going to talk about in a minute, but no counts. And there is actually a very understandable reason why there are no counts within the British aristocracy, and that is because of the 5 titles I've just spoken about, the oldest of them is Earl. So before the Norman conquest of 1066, there were earls already in Britain. There were people who held the title of Earl, and Earl is the kind of social equivalent of the French title Count or Comte. So after the Norman conquest, when William I imported a lot of French governing systems, many titles were imported from France, but because there was already an equivalent to Count didn't get imported, and the people stayed being called earls. Weirdly, the wives of earls are called countesses, and that's because the earl is basically the equivalent of a count, but earls get to be etymologically English, while their countess wives are etymologically French. And interestingly, we call local regions in the UK, and indeed in many other places in the world, counties, not earldoms. Okay, so now let's take our 5 aristocratic titles one at a time and talk through what they mean, how to address these people, and how to address their families. This is something that's always very interesting to know, and it's always interesting to see when a character in a 19th century novel gets it wrong. So let's start off with the highest rank, the rank of Duke, and let us create a fictional Duke. We'll call him John Smith. His name is John Smith, but he is the Duke of somewhere. That means you address him as Lord somewhere, not as Lord Smith, absolutely not. His surname doesn't come into his title. He is the Duke of somewhere, and you address him as Lord somewhere. You might also call him simply Duke or Your Grace. So your title as a Duke, your Lord somewhere, was always different from your surname and was always geographical, relating historically to the part of the country that you and your family held land and power in. So historically, traditionally, this was the part of the country that the monarch had given you power over. By the 19th century, the political administrative system was a bit different, obviously, but those kind of regional, geographically related titles still existed. So Lord Somewhere's wife would be the Duchess of Somewhere, and you would address her as Lady Somewhere or Duchess or Your Grace, never as Mrs. Smith or Lady Smith or anything like that. Her surname would never be mentioned by basically anyone. Now, let's look at the eldest son of Lord and Lady Somewhere. This is where things get a bit complicated and fascinating. Many members of the British aristocracy held multiple titles. So the Duke of Somewhere might also be the Earl of Elsewhere. Why these people held multiple titles is complicated. Some of it was to do with intermarrying of aristocratic families and therefore kind of merging titles. If you were the Duke of Somewhere but also the Earl of Elsewhere, being a Duke is much more important than being an Earl, so you wouldn't be bothered to be known as the Earl of Elsewhere. You'd only really care about being known as the Duke of Somewhere. So when this happened, the Duke of Somewhere would often lend one of his lesser titles to his eldest son as a courtesy, and then his eldest son would be known as Lord Elsewhere. Now we come to the younger sons of a Duke, and here again there is a different form of address. So the younger son of a Duke is known as Lord, first name, surname. So the Duke of Somewhere's younger son would be known as, say, Lord James Smith. Title doesn't come into it here because he's not a duke, he's not the eldest son, he doesn't get a title, but he does get to be called Lord, first name, surname, as a courtesy. That's what these things are called, courtesy titles. Basically anyone except for the Duke himself, the Earl himself, they hold their titles as a courtesy. I've said the word courtesy too many times and it stopped having any meaning. So the Duke's younger son gets to be known as Lord James Smith, but would most commonly be known as Lord James. He would never be known as Lord Smith. That would be wrong, but he would be called Lord James, Lord first name. And now we come to the daughters of the Duke. So the daughters of a Duke get to be known as Lady, first name, surname. So say he named his daughter Elizabeth, she would be known as Lady Elizabeth Smith or Lady Elizabeth. Never as Lady Smith, that would be wrong. Now let's move on to the title of Marquis. The title of Marquis is beneath Duke, but a lot of things operate in quite a similar way. Let's create a fictional Marquis. His name is Thomas Brown, but he's the Marquis of Blankshire. So you address him as Lord Blankshire, not Lord Brown. You would never call him simply Marquis, as you might for a duke. That was inappropriate. I don't know why. Nor would you call him Your Grace. That is only for dukes. But you might call him Your Lord or Your Lordship. But you would probably only do that if he was like really your social superior by a long way. If you were like both fairly upper class, you would probably just call him Lord Blankshire. And again, if you were a Marquis, your title was generally different from your surname and was geographic, relating historically to the part of the country your family held land and power in. Lord Blankshire's wife would be the Marchioness of Blankshire, and you would address her as Lady Blankshire, or if you were quite far beneath her, you might call her My Lady or Your Ladyship. When it comes to the children of the Marquis and the Marchioness, it's very, very similar to the children of dukes. So for the eldest son, again, the Marquis would probably have a other title, a lesser title that he could lend to his son as a courtesy title, which is why in Anthony Trollope's novel The Way We Live Now, the Marquis of Old Recky's son is called Lord Nitterdale. That is because the Marquis of Old Lecky is, you know, probably the Earl or the Viscount or something else of Nitterdale and can lend that to his son. When it comes to the younger son of a Marquis, as with dukes, they're called Lord first name surname, usually just Lord first name, and the same with the daughters, they're called Lady first name surname, usually just Lady first name. So our Marquis, Thomas Brown, Marquis of Blankshire, might have 3 children. His eldest son might be Lord Nowhere, and his 2 other children, his younger son and his daughter, might be, say, Lord James Brown and Lady Susan Brown. Right, moving down to the 3rd rank of the aristocracy, which is Earl. Let's create a fictional Earl. Luckily, I have one to hand from my novel, The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst. His name is Alexander Ravensdale, but I don't think you'd actually know that unless you read the dramatis personae at the beginning, because he's never referred to as that, because why would he be? He's an Earl. He's referred to as Lord Wickford. He's the Earl of Wickford. You call him Lord Wickford, not Lord Ravensdale. You would never call him simply Earl, as you might a duke, but you might call him my lord if you were, say, his servant. Again, if you were an Earl, your title was generally different from your surname. It was geographical and related historically to the part of the country that your family had held power in. Lord Wickford's wife is the Countess of Wickford, and she is known as Lady Wickford. If you were her servant, you might call her my lady. And then turning to the eldest son of the family, again, an Earl might lend his eldest son one of his other titles as a courtesy title. So the reason why Lord Wickford's son in The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst is called Lord Solbridge, which I'm sure bemused all readers, it's because Lord Wickford has lent his son one of his titles, Viscount of Solbridge, as a courtesy, and therefore Solbridge gets known as Solbridge or Lord Solbridge rather than his name, which is Alexander, as is his father's name, just for extra confusion. Okay, the reason why I've ended up making this video is because someone asked me in a Q&A a little while ago to explain the titles in this novel, and I thought, I can't do that in the Q&A. I need like a full hour. I'm not just explaining the titles in this novel, but I thought I would explain all the titles for your interest. Okay, when it comes to the younger sons of earls, here we have a slight difference from dukes and marquises. So if you are the younger son of an earl, you do not get called lord. You're not allowed to be called lord, but you do get to be known as the honourable. So if Lord and Lady Wickford had had a second son, a younger son called, say, Peter, he would be known as the Honourable Peter Ravensdale. Doesn't get called Lord, doesn't get called Sir, but he gets to be known as the Honourable Peter Ravensdale. When it comes to the daughters, however, the daughters of earls do get treated like the daughters of dukes and marquises, and they get called Lady First Name Surname, usually just Lady First Name, which is why Lady Rose in Montgomery Hearst is called Lady Rose, not just Rose. Her full name is Lady Rose Ravendale, which I think I only mentioned like once in the book because I thought it would confuse everyone, but she is known as Lady Rose. That is how you'll be known if you were the daughter of an earl. Moving down the ranks to the fourth rank of the aristocracy, which is Viscount. I'm going to take a real life Viscount this time because I was looking things up and found a real one that you'll have heard of. His name was Henry Temple. Have you ever heard of Henry Temple? No, but he was also the Viscount Palmerston, which means you would address him as Lord Palmerston. You might have heard of him. He was a very famous 19th century politician. You would not call him Lord Temple because although that was his surname, he was Viscount Palmerston, always to be known as Lord Palmerston. Now, many Viscounts, such as Lord Palmerston, had a different surname to their title, but some viscounts, especially in newer peerages, did have the same surname and title. So, for example, in 1842, General Rowland Hill, who was a British Army officer, was made a Viscount, and he was known as Viscount Hill, to be addressed as Lord Hill. So basically, for the top three rungs of the aristocracy, if you're a Duke, a Marquis, or an Earl, then your title and your surname are almost certainly not the same. If you're a Viscount, it could go either way. The wife of a Viscount was a Viscountess, so Lord Palmerston's wife would be Viscountess Palmerston, and you would address her as Lady Palmerston, or, you know, maybe my lady. And then all of the sons of a Viscount, whether they're younger or elder, they all get known as the honourable first name surname. No one gets to be called Lord or Lady here. And it's the same for the daughters of a Viscount. They're all called the honourable first name surname, no Lord or Lady here. I should say that for the honourables, you would never shorten it to like the honourable first name. You would never be like the Honourable John. That wasn't a thing. But you might say the Honourable Mr. Smith. You would shorten it differently to when you use Lord or Lady. It's really confusing, isn't it? No one really needs to know this, but I know, and I thought I would share it with you. Okay, the fifth rank of the aristocracy is Baron. So let's take another real-life Baron. George Gordon Byron. Ring any bells? Baron Byron, to be addressed as Lord Byron, or possibly my lord. And yes, that is right. Lord Byron's surname and his title are the same. So Baron is at the bottom of the aristocratic ranks. It's the lowest rank of the aristocracy, and it is far less likely to be linked to geography. So many barons have the same title as their surname. Not all, but a lot of them. The wife of a baron would be a baroness. So Lord Byron's wife would be Baroness Byron, but you'd address her as Lady Byron, never as Baroness Byron. That would be weird, obviously. You would call her Lady Byron, or maybe my lady if you were her servant. And then all the sons and the daughters of a baron get to be known as the honourable first name surname, or, you know, the honourable Mr. Byron, the honourable Miss Byron, but they don't get to be known by Lord or Lady. So is that confusing? Probably. A few more things to talk about. Generally, it was the men who held the titles, and women who had titles, who you were addressing as lady. They basically held like honorary titles conferred on them by their husbands or fathers' titles. However, there were a few exceptions. Basically, there were a few women who like petitioned the monarch to be allowed to inherit their own titles, and were allowed to. This was mostly in Scotland, but there were a few women who were actually peeresses in their own right. So I think in 1818, out of the like 508 peers, aristocrats, 16 of them were women, were peeresses in their own right. They didn't get to sit in the House of Lords, of course, because they were women and it was the 19th century, but they did like hold that title themselves. I don't know too much about that. I've come across it like a few times and find it fascinating. Like I said, it's mostly in Scotland. Another thing I find quite interesting to look at is kind of what happens when the daughter of one of these aristocrats gets married. So if you were the daughter of an aristocrat, you might have a title conferred on you by your father. Say you were the daughter of our fictional Duke, your Lady Elizabeth Smith, and you marry a man called John Brown. He's a commoner, he's not a member of the aristocracy, so he's just John Brown, but you are Lady Elizabeth Smith. So once you get married, you are still a Lady Elizabeth, but now you're just Lady Elizabeth Brown. So you'll be introduced as like Mr. Brown and Lady Elizabeth Brown. However, if you were Lady Elizabeth Smith and you were the daughter of a Duke, but you married another Duke, then you would become the Duchess of Elsewhere, and you'd be known as Lady Elsewhere, not Lady Elizabeth. Alternatively, if we have a commoner, a Miss Elizabeth Smith, a regular Miss Elizabeth Smith who marries the Earl of Elsewhere, then she would become Lady Elsewhere, and she gets a title from her husband's title. And this is quite interesting to know for literature. So for example, Lady Susan in Jane Austen, the reason why she is called Lady First Name, not Lady Surname, is because she is the daughter of a member of the aristocracy. She must be the daughter of an Earl, a Marquis, or a Duke. Also very interesting to note that in Pride and Prejudice, Lady Catherine de Bourgh is always referred to as Lady Catherine, Lady First Name, which means that her title comes from her own family, her father's family, not her husband. Which is interesting because we know that her late husband is Sir Lewis de Burgh, presumably a knight. We'll talk a bit more about the difference between knights and baronets in a second, but Lady Catherine is not known as Lady de Burgh. She's known as Lady Catherine. She is presumably the daughter of an earl. We know that her nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, is the younger son of an earl, so it would make sense if she is the daughter of an earl. If Colonel Fitzwilliam wasn't a military man, he would be known as the Honourable Mr. Fitzwilliam, but his military rank kind of does away with the need for that anyway. So Lady Catherine has always been Lady Catherine. Before she married, she was Lady Catherine, presumably Fitzwilliam actually, looking at that family. I'm assuming that her brother is Colonel Fitzwilliam's father. That would make sense. So she was Lady Catherine Fitzwilliam, then she married Sir Louis de Burgh, and she didn't need his title because she already had her own, so she didn't become Lady de Burgh, she became Lady Catherine de Burgh. And we know this again because Mr. Darcy's mother is referred to as Lady Anne Darcy. She was also the daughter of an earl, but she married a commoner, a Mr. Darcy. So she was Lady Anne Darcy, but she didn't get to hand on any aristocratic titles to her family, which is why Mr. Darcy is just called Mr. Darcy. He is a commoner, he's not a member of the aristocracy, but his mother was, which kind of feeds into how kind of socially important he is within the world of Pride and Prejudice. I do think it's quite important to know that Lady Catherine is a member of the aristocracy and that her title comes from her own family, not her husband. Like, she is very high up within society. Okay, so now we've dealt with the aristocracy, let us turn to the titled commoners, the people called Sir. So there were two kinds of people addressed as Sir in the 19th century, baronets and knights. So a baronet is a hereditary title, like all the aristocratic ones. It passes through the male line, and baronets are called Sir first name, surname, and are addressed as Sir first name, never Sir surname. That would be wrong. So for example, we have Sir Thomas Bertram from Mansfield Park, we have Sir Leicester Dedlock from Bleak House, we have Sir Felix Carberry in The Way We Live Now, and these people get known as Sir Thomas, Sir Leicester, Sir Felix. They don't get known as Sir Bertram. However, the wife of a baronet is known as Lady Surname. So it is Sir Leicester and Lady Dedlock in Bleak House. It is Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram in Mansfield Park. Although the baronet gets known by his first name with Sir before, the wife gets known as Lady and then the baronet's surname. Is that weird? Yes. That's how it worked. The children of a baronet get no special names or titles, nothing fancy there, although the eldest son will inherit the baronetcy after his father dies. And then the other kind of titled commoner, the other person that gets called Sir, is a knight. So knight is basically the non-hereditary version of baronet. So most of it works very similarly to a baronetcy, but you can't pass on a knighthood to your son. So you get knighted during your lifetime for something that means the monarch or the government like you, but you can't pass on your title to anyone else. So William Lucas in Pride and Prejudice is a knight. He's not a baronet. He is a man who has made his money in trade. The government / the monarch like him for this, and therefore have knighted him. After the baronet, he is known as Sir first name surname or Sir first name, so he is Sir William or Sir William Lucas, never Sir Lucas. But his wife is known as Lady Surname, so his wife is Lady Lucas. As she is indeed in Pride and Prejudice. Their children get no special names, and the eldest son will not inherit his father's title on his father's death. So the reason why Sir William Lucas is a Sir, but also doesn't seem to be that socially important within Pride and Prejudice, and seems to be a bit looked down on by the Bingleys, is because Sir William Lucas has made his money in trade, and has become a knight later on in life because of his successful business ventures. It's very entertaining that the Bingleys look down on him, because actually the Bingleys have also made their money in trade historically, but they're like a generation on from that and like to pretend they're part of the gentry, which they're not. More on that in a second. So, does that all make sense? I'm not quite done. A few other terms you may hear in 19th century novels relating to rank and class that you might find interesting. I thought I would go through them. So, the gentry. What are the gentry? So the gentry are basically like the social group beneath the aristocracy. At the top of 19th century society, you have the aristocracy, the peers, the dukes, the marquises, the earls, the viscounts and the barons. But then beneath them, we have the landed gentry. So the word gentry or landed gentry refers to basically wealthy people who own their own land, their own estates, and often are making money off that land. So baronets are usually part of the gentry. Knights can be part of the gentry because they're technically commoners, not part of the aristocracy. They are therefore part of the gentry. but there are also many, many people who are part of the landed gentry within the 19th century who didn't have titles. So Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, he's a member of the landed gentry, as is Mr. Bennet, although Mr. Bennet is a member of the landed gentry on a much smaller scale. Mr. Bennet owns a lot less land than Mr. Darcy, has a lot less income from his land. He is a member of the landed gentry. As Elizabeth says at one point, he is a gentleman, but he's not quite as far up the internal ranks of the gentry as Mr. Darcy is, partly because Mr. Darcy owns so much land, and also partly because Mr. Darcy's mother was from the aristocracy, even though he himself is not an aristocrat. You will find many people throughout 19th century literature who are members of the gentry. In general, if someone owns like a big house, a big manor house in the countryside, they're a member of the landed gentry. So, you know, Mr. Jarndyce in Bleak House, Roger Carbery in The Way We Live Now, those kinds of people. Another term we need to look at is the term squire. So the word squire basically means landowner or gentleman. So the local member of the landed gentry might be referred to as the local squire, or even as squire surname. This wasn't an official title though, in the same way that lord or sir was. I'm not 100% certain whether it ever was, but certainly by the 19th century it wasn't. But it was sometimes used as a form of address, especially in rural areas, towards the landed gentry. So you may notice, if you've read The Way We Live Now, that Roger Carbery is often referred to as the Squire or the Squire of Carbery. And in Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, Mr. Hamley is often called Squire Hamley or the Squire. This was not like an official aristocratic title. This was something that people would get called if they were like the local landowner. I think I mentioned a couple of times in Montgomery Hearst that Sir Frederick Hammersmith, who was a baronet, is also often considered the Squire of Melford, and that people also refer to him as the Squire of Melford. I don't actually know if that is mentioned in the novel. I definitely had that in a draft at some point, but that may have got cut. Some other interesting terms. Let's look at county family versus town family. So within a rural neighbourhood in the 19th century, because of the way land was held, you know, by local landowners, often there would be lots of local landowners owning larger estates, often with people paying them rent. They might even own whole villages. And then there would be other towns, kind of bigger urban centres, some of which might be owned by landowners, but within which some people would own their own property. And there was quite a lot of social division in the 19th century between county families, i.e. local landowner families, members of the landed gentry, and the people who lived within towns. Wealthier, middle-class people living in towns might try, and sometimes fail, to cultivate the acquaintance of the county families, because that would be considered, you know, socially advantageous to align yourself with those big local names. In general, county families and like the gentry often moved about quite a bit in the course of a year, so they would often live in London for the season. I probably need to explain what the season is as well, don't I? The season was like the time in London where a lot of people were in London, and therefore all the parties happened, and it often coincided with when Parliament was sitting, because all the members of the House of Lords and House of Commons might want to be there for Parliament. So it's often kind of like February to June, July-ish, sometimes a bit later, sometimes a bit earlier, depending on the year, depended on Parliament. And then come August, the county families would go back to their counties, to their big estates, and enjoy the summer and autumn. Whereas a town family, you know, a middle-class person living in a town would probably stay where they were all year round. And this social division is like really interesting. It's really clear in a novel like Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. So the Hamleys and the Cumnors are county families, whereas Molly and her father, who's a doctor, are, you know, townspeople, as are the Miss Brownings. So they're kind of all respectable middle-class families, but they are town people, not county people. And that explains some of the social tension in Wives and Daughters. I also did a lot with the dynamic of that in The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, because I find it fascinating. And it's something that when you know about it, it's there beneath the surface in a lot of 19th century literature, that you don't necessarily spot on a first read. Another term I came across in Wives and Daughters that confused me for ages is Lord Lieutenant. A Lord Lieutenant was a person who had been given kind of local control over the local county's militia, and this responsibility was usually given to titled people, so they would be known as the Lord Lieutenant. So Lord Cumnor in Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell is an Earl, but he's also the county's Lord Lieutenant. I'm pretty sure like the Lord Lieutenants kind of having sway over the local militia is more of a like first half of the 19th century thing than a second half of the 19th century thing. I think this practice was kind of dying out by the end. Two other terms I think are interesting to look at, heir apparent and heir presumptive. So the heir apparent is someone who is definitely the heir to a title or an estate. So if the Duke of somewhere has an elder son, that elder son is the heir apparent, because so long as he lives until his father dies, he will be the Duke of somewhere after his father. An heir presumptive, however, is something slightly different. So an heir presumptive is a person who would inherit the title if the current holder were to die right now, but there is the chance that they might not inherit the title depending on circumstances. So basically, if the Duke of somewhere is unmarried and has no children, then his closest male relation, say his nephew, would be his heir. If the Duke of somewhere dies tomorrow, the nephew will inherit. However, say the Duke of somewhere gets married next week and has a son next year, then this son is now his heir and the nephew is no longer the heir. I haven't spoken about entails in this video. Should I speak about entails? If you hold a title as an aristocrat or as a baronet, then you have to pass that title on to your closest male heir, which is probably your elder son, but if you don't have a son, it might be your nephew or your cousin or your first cousin once removed, what have you. However, how land was passed was slightly different to titles. So sometimes a person could just leave their land to whoever they wanted to leave their land to, but often members of the landed gentry and the aristocracy would have an entail which bound them to only leave their property to their closest male heir. So probably their elder son, but could be a nephew or a cousin. You could break the entail, you could change that rule, but only if you had the consent of both the current holder and the heir apparent. But if you didn't have the consent of the heir, then you as the land holder could not leave your property where you wanted. If it was entailed, you would have to leave it to the next male heir. Hence the plot of Pride and Prejudice, basically the reason why Mr. Collins is going to inherit the estate from Mr. Bennet is because the estate is entailed. And the fact that Mrs. Bennet doesn't get how it works and keeps like complaining to her husband that he hasn't changed it when he isn't capable of doing so, is partly there to show us that she's not that clever, but it's also partly there to show us that she is not from this world. She is not from the landed gentry. She's from the middle classes. She was from a town family, not a county family. Her father worked as a local lawyer in the town nearby, and the fact that she doesn't understand the entails is partly to do with her being from a different social class. Finally, wanted to very quickly go through military and naval titles. To be honest, I know a lot less about these, but I can tell you who was at the bottom and who was at the top. So we're just going to do that quickly in case it's interesting. So when it comes to military titles, there are other ranks. I'm not going to talk about every rank because there are quite a lot of like intermediary ranks, but the kind of main ones, very, very top of the army, field marshal, beneath them, general, brigadier, colonel, major, captain, and lieutenant was the lowest officer. And then naval titles, admiral at the top, then commodore, captain, commander, lieutenant. So lieutenant is the lowest of both the military and the naval titles, but interestingly, if you're a captain in the Navy, you're higher up than if you're a captain in the army. A captain in the army is lower down and less important. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to say. So I hope this has been clear and interesting, and not just like a wall of words. I find this stuff really interesting, and I do think that if you know some of this stuff, you will notice interesting things within 19th century literature. And I think especially it can be useful to know this stuff if you read lots of Anthony Trollope, because he loves an aristocratic family. You know, Jane Austen and Dickens, they have some titled people, some baronets and a few people from the aristocracy in their books, but like nowhere near as many as Anthony Trollope. Anthony Trollope loved to write about the aristocracy, and sometimes it is very hard to get your head around who is who and who's related to who and why they're called what. So do let me know down in the comments if you have any questions about any of this, if this has made you think about anything you've spotted in 19th century books that you've read. If you enjoyed this video, do please consider supporting me on Patreon or giving me a tip on SuperThanks. That's just beneath the video on YouTube, and you know, sharing this video with anyone you know who loves 19th century history and literature and might find this interesting. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.